Assalamu alaikum everyone, and welcome to our 5th Critical Thinking Skype seminar. I'm Hera, I'm the project manager at New Horizons, and we are joined today by Yasmin Amin, who is finalising a PhD at the University of Exeter on humour and laughter in the hadith. She's obtained a postgraduate diploma in Islamic Studies from the American University in Cairo in 2006, as well as an MA in Islamic Studies from the American University in Cairo in 2010. Her dissertation was on the hadiths narrated by Salama. Prior to that, she had a lengthy career in business administration. She's also a co-editor of the upcoming volume Islamic Interpretive Tradition and Gender Justice. So Yasmin sent over 2 articles for everyone to look at. The first one was Forbidden Firebrands, Frivolous Iqtibats according to Medieval Arab Critics, which was looking at examples of quotation from the Quran. And the other one was The Merry Men of Medina, Comedy and Humanity in the Early Days of Islam, which was looking at examples of humour in the hadith traditions. So thank you, Yasmin, for your time, and I will hand over to you.
I wanted to say a few words first about what possessed me to research this, because everywhere I go, when I mention the topic, everyone stares at me in disbelief, and they don't think that Muslims even laugh or have a sense of humor. And I suppose that this is related to the Danish cartoon crisis, where people were actually got killed for drawing cartoons of the Prophet and so on. And while I was researching for my master's and looking at the instances where Salama related things, she actually is a narrator of 2 of the humorous hadiths that mentioned that the Prophet laughed and that he and the companions joked. And one of the jokes was even said to have been repeated for years and years after the occurrence. And every time they narrated this joke, everyone laughed. So I felt that, okay, fine, they are repeating the joke and they are all laughing about it. So there must be other instances. They're not isolated instances. And the more I looked, the more I found. And I actually also decided to look into the Shiite corpus, because the Shiites have a reputation of being maudlin and crying all the time and hitting themselves, especially in Ashura, because of the death of Al-Hussein, and they feel guilty that the Kufans didn't help him. So they try to atone. And in fact, I found even more instances in their hadith corpus that were saved, even more than the already huge amounts that I found in the Sunni hadith corpus. So in fact, both corpora include so many instances of humor and laughter that I'm beginning to wonder what happened and why they were removed. And that they were removed is actually a fact, because at some point in Islamic history, it became undignified to laugh. And the scholars, they edited out the instances of laughter, and they accused the Prophet of not laughing and only smiling. And in fact, there is proof that this was done deliberately, because you have a hadith in the collections, in the major collections, where someone did a really bad job of editing. And you can see how sloppy it was, because in one of the hadiths, it says that there was a man who came to visit the Prophet, and Aisha was in another room, and then she heard them smile, so she went in to see what they were smiling about. So, I mean, for the life of me, I have never ever been able to hear someone smile.
Yeah.
It has to be a laugh, because a smile is simply soundless. So that shows to me that they deliberately edited out the word laughter and replaced it with the word smile, as if laughter is a crime, even though the Quran says explicitly that it is God who makes us laugh and it is Him who makes us cry. So it is a legitimate emotion granted to us by God. So why would they feel they need to edit it out? And this actually reinforced me even more in my determination to go through with this and finish the research. My research is in 5 chapters. In the first one, I look at humor theories, and I discover that the humor theories are all Western-centric and modern, and they are not much use in retracing the history and applying them on ancient or medieval texts, especially that some of them contradict the Quran. There is the superiority theory and the incongruity theory, which basically posit that people laugh when they feel superior to someone else, or the incongruity one is when they see someone with problems, like, for example, a blind man spilling his drink or a lame man walking funnily, then they laugh. But the Quran explicitly says not to mock other people. So these are useless in analyzing the hadith, and I found out that the main reason for the laughter between the companions and the Prophet and the people of his household in general, and even strangers, are completely different reasons from our modern reasons. They were laughing to break the ice with strangers. They were laughing as a sign of leniency. One of my favorite hadiths that show the laughter and show the leniency is when the women complained to the Prophet that they don't benefit from his knowledge, that he readily gives in the mosques after prayer to the men, and they are excluded from these classes, if we can call them classes, and they demanded a day to be given to them where they can ask and learn. And the Prophet set aside a day for them in one of the chambers of his wives, which were rotating because he spent the night with different wives in different days. So the instance of the hadith is that these women were sitting there and they were talking and asking and everything. And they became relaxed, their voices were raised, their veils slipped from their heads, and they started to be loud and laughing. And then suddenly there is a knock on the door, and Umar ibn al-Khattab comes, the wife, the designated wife. There are several versions of this hadith. In one version it's Aisha, in another version it's Zainab. So you have different wives. So however, the designated wife of the day asks from behind the door, who is it? And the answer is Umar ibn al-Khattab. And then the women, all of them, they spring up, adjust their veils, shut up completely, and the Prophet bursts out laughing. So Umar enters and sees a laughing Prophet, and he asks him, what is he laughing about? And the Prophet tells him what had transpired. And Umar becomes livid. He starts yelling at the women, you are enemies of yourselves. You should respect the Prophet more than me. And why are you doing this? You don't respect him or what? And then one of the women, she replies back and she says, because he is kind and you are rough and uncouth. So before Umar manages to have another outburst, the Prophet tells him, you know, Umar, if Iblis, the devil, sees you walking on the street, he will cross to the other side, because even Iblis is afraid of you. Mm-hmm. And then everyone laughs and the situation is no longer explosive. So this is one of my favorite ahadiths, showing the leniency, that he was one of his community, he was one of the people. He didn't think too much of himself, and he allowed the women to be at ease. He wasn't too concerned about their veils. He was more concerned about them feeling relaxed and being able to ask whatever they wanted. So it was more about the inner core rather than the outward appearance. And this is something I feel that we need to remember again, because we seem to have lost this. We are all concerned more with rituals and how to do them, the length of the clothes we wear or the thickness of the veil, rather than what is actually inside the inner core. So this is, in one chapter, I'm dealing with the hadith that mention that God laughs, And I found this to be quite nice, that even God is supposed to be laughing, and it challenges the idea that God is this sour bureaucrat who sits there with a pencil and just writes our sins and to reward us or punish us for good deeds or sins, but that he and his laughter was interpreted by God's laughter was interpreted by the prophet as a sign of his mercy and his forgiveness, because one of the hadith in that group says, we will never fear anything from a laughing God. So at the end of the day, it's reassuring to the believers that God is kind and merciful and forgiving and not at all vengeful or mean. So I have another chapter where I have all the instances, well, not all of them, but selected. I found too many. In fact, if I had used them all, I would have ended up with 2-3 volumes. So I made a conscious choice to only choose those where there is a phrase denoting that the Prophet actually laughed. And you have many of those where he laughs until people could see his back teeth, people could see his molars. In 2 of them, he falls back on his back laughing. In another few versions, he claps on his thighs with laughter. So there is nothing irreverent or disrespectful about laughter, and it's definitely not undignified. So I've chosen those, and they show that the Prophet laughed with his companions, at his companions. He even played pranks on his wives and his grandchildren. And they were just like any normal human beings who needed to laugh. And everyone laughs in the same language. So it was also used for strangers in the marketplace to alleviate certain conditions where people were afraid before an impeding battle and things like that.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. So what I noticed about the Merry Men of Medina is that it's looking at the hadith tradition, which is really interesting because the hadith are often the stuff that people find most problematic when it comes to things around sort of gender justice or, punishments for various things. And so I found it interesting that you're using the hadith to humanize the Prophet, when often, especially nowadays, many people try to, I guess, underplay the importance of hadith in some ways, because I guess some people don't find it very helpful. And I was just wondering about your thoughts about that tension there.
Okay, first of all, you said a key word that is very important to me, to humanize the Prophet. And this is something that I feel very strongly about, because the Quran says over 114 times that he is human and he was chosen from among you. It reminds him, it reminds the community that he is human. And this is something we seem to have forgotten, because the more we moved closer to modern times, the more the Prophet became a semi-god or a superhuman. He was put on a pedestal somewhere, and he became untouchable. And so much is being lost from this, and it's also counter-Quranic, because the Christians and the Jews were criticized in the Quran for elevating their monks and their rabbis to be gods next to God. It is in chapter 3, I think it's verse 91, but anyhow. So we are doing the same thing to our Prophet. We have forgotten his humanity, and I feel very strongly about this, because if he is not human, then we cannot emulate him. But if he is one of us, it makes it easier for us to aspire to be as close as possible to what we think he was, and be good Muslims. So this is the first thing. The second thing, of course, everyone knows that the hadith is very problematic, and there are many forged traditions. There are traditions that were forged for political reasons, for ideological reasons, even for stupid things like geographical reasons. You have hadith, tons of them, praising a particular geographical location that the Prophet never even visited. like a small town in Algeria. I mean, the Prophet was never in Algeria. But with the forgeries, they forged everything to raise the status of certain places, certain people, certain professions, and so on. But we will not go into that. I chose to use the hadith, and I have a big disclaimer in chapter 1 saying that I'm not looking at the authenticity of the hadith. I'm just taking the hadith at face value, because if the people chose to record it and keep it in these collections, they became part of the collective memory, and they say something, even if not about the Prophet per se, but at least about the image the people at that time had about the Prophet. So it also serves as a good historiographical tool to see, as I told you, they edited out the laughter at some point in history. But before that, it was okay to laugh. So it tells you about the development of the Muslim thought. And Ibn Khaldun comes in very handy, because Ibn Khaldun, in his Muqaddimah, he theorizes that dynasties and kingdoms have a lifespan, just like the human beings. And during the youth of this kingdom or dynasty, people are very strong, secure, so everything is allowed. So they don't censor anything. You even have, like in the early Abbasid times, people writing really subversive material, like Ibn Rawanj al-Mulhid. Ibn Rawanj is a heretic. He wrote that God didn't exist and people didn't kill him. He wasn't excommunicated. People wrote books in answer to his claims, and he lived happily ever after until he died of old age. But during the time of Al-Ghazali, for example, the Mongol hordes were coming, Baghdad was sacked, the libraries were set afire, and the dynasties were becoming very old and disintegrating. So the jurists, they started to make everything haram. Everything was prohibited. They didn't want the people to rise up or question why the ruler is not fighting, why are they losing this war, why is the kingdom disintegrating, why are they threatened, why are their women being kidnapped and sold into slavery and all of that. So they restrict everything inclusive of laughter.
And the other thing that I noticed was that, so a lot of the hadiths are about the Prophet's life and, his family life. He's playing with his grandchildren, he's playing pranks on his wives. Well, those were the examples I read in the article. But I think the problem we have nowadays is the Prophet having fun with his family or playing jokes on other people, and the tension of people making fun of the Prophet or making fun of Islam. People get very protective and defensive, and in some places it's a crime, but then at the same time you do have the Prophet, poets and stuff were put to death or died because of things that they did say, and again that's to do with politics. But I guess for me, how do we reconcile that idea, and how do we use Islamic material in a humorous way today when it is so sensitive?
This is where the second article comes in, the firebrands.
Yeah.
Because it shows you some of the jokes in there, or the anecdotes, were sourced from medieval Abbasid and Umayyad, the earliest two dynasties. So the Umayyads were right after the rightfully guided caliphs, and the Abbasids were after them. So they are the earliest extant texts from the Islamic heritage. And they show you that they used the Quran in their jokes. And they had no issues with that at all. I mean, there is a distinction to be made that they did not use the Quran in jokes to ridicule the Prophet or the Quran or Islam or any other prophets for that matter. They used the Quran out of other reasons. First of all, to learn Arabic, especially after the Islamic conquests, when you had all these foreigners coming to Islam and they needed to learn Arabic and to be able to read the Quran and so on. They used the Quran to teach Arabic. So everyone, whether they were foreigners or native Arabs, they spoke Arabic and they knew the Quran. That's number one. Number two, The Quran was known in all the different parts of the Islamic Empire. So it was known in Turkey, it was known in Persia, it was known in Egypt, it was known in Morocco, and so on. It's the same Quran, everyone knows it. So for a joke to be understood, using the Quran was a perfect way because everyone will understand the punchline. It was nothing irreverent or blasphemous or whatever. Today we have become so sensitive because, in my personal perspective, I believe we are far removed from our faith and we focus on other things, not the real faith. I mean, yes, we do charity and we are good to our neighbors and all these things, but to be secure in your faith means that you don't feel attacked with every little thing. I mean, even the cartoons ridiculing the Prophet shouldn't have caused all this damage and all these demonstrations and burning flags and so on, not because of anything else, but the Quran says to the Prophet, they will ridicule you. They will accuse you of being a poet. They will accuse you of being a magician. Just don't listen to them. God knows that it will tighten your chest. He will be upset and so on, but don't worry about them because the truth will come out in the end. So, in my own perspective, maybe I'm wrong, but for me, ignoring these cartoons would have been the better option rather than to reinforce the stereotype that Muslims can't take a joke, they are all grim and terrorists and willing to, demonstrate, set things on fire, demolish stuff, have a revolt. If we had ignored them, they would have been bored and they would have stopped out of their own accord since the Muslims don't care.
Yeah.
But ever since, the book by Salman Rushdie, The Satanic Verses, when the Muslim world went in complete uproar, Khomeini issued fatwa that Salman Rushdie needs to be killed. People in Bangladesh and Pakistan were burning flags and burning copies of the book that they hadn't even read, just to because someone said it is blasphemy. But the Quran told Muhammad, the Prophet, they will do this. Just ignore them. The truth will come out in the end. So why don't we follow the advice of our own book instead of reinforcing a picture that is very Islamophobic? And so I believe that in our world, humor is, you have all these proverbs, Arabic or otherwise, that laughter is medicine for the soul. And if we can laugh our way through the problems, this is definitely better than demonstrating somewhere or setting a flag on fire. That won't help anyone.
That's interesting because it is, I think, to do with the idea that most Muslims nowadays don't feel secure, as in they do feel that the world is against them and against Islam. So I think that's where the sensitivity may come in. But I don't know how to... I think the thing that Muslims struggle with is because we have no central body, it is so decentralized and everyone's sort of doing their own thing. There is no way to... I mean, we don't have a pope who can issue a statement saying, these jokes are now acceptable, or we'll turn a blind eye to them. So in your eyes, what do you think the future is? How do you think this will pan out, or how can we resolve it? It's a big ask, I know.
I don't know, but at least for me, I am trying to do my bits for this future, where I show a different side of Islam, when it was okay to laugh, when it was okay to use the Quran in jokes without anyone fainting or dying or arresting someone.
Yeah.
I mean, even if the quotations, the iqtibas from the Quran, they had so many different examples. They used either small portions, an entire verse, or they mixed verses. You have anecdotes where you have an entire story that goes over 2 pages using at least 12 different chapters from the Quran. You have a story about a woman who only conversed with her relatives using Quran quotations. So we were close to the Quran, we knew the Quran by heart, and we were secure in our faith. And that we need to remember that. Yes, today Muslims are even more diverse than they were during the time of the Islamic empire or the Islamic conquest. You have entire populations who are Muslims, but they can't read the Quran for themselves. They have to read it in translation. They read it for their prayers. They read it maybe in Ramadan, but they don't know it. They don't. They cannot move within the chapters, and they couldn't tell you at the top of their head, well, this and this is in chapter so and so. I'm not advocating that you memorize the entire Quran. I'm not but befriend the Quran and know it, and then you will be secure in your faith, and then you will appreciate the jokes that use the Quran, and because this was the vehicle that the jokes could travel. So the littérateur or the author who wrote the collection of jokes in Iraq, in 8th century Iraq, this book ended up in 10th century Spain, and people were still able to appreciate the jokes and laugh because they still knew the Quran. So there is a very, very nice joke. In the jokes, you have two different protagonists. One that is the miser. He doesn't want to share anything he knows he has. He's very protective of his food, of his whatever he owns. And you have the other type who is the tufaili, and the tufaili is like a party crasher or a social parasite. They invited themselves to parties just to eat. They didn't want to spend any money. So the joke is that this guy, one of the misers, he owns a fig plantation, and the figs are ripe, and he goes to harvest them. And the Tufaili sees that, and he makes it a point to go and eat these figs for free. So he approaches this man who hides the figs by covering them up with his garment. And he sits down pretending he doesn't know that, and they have a conversation where they introduce each other and so on. And naturally, the hospitality should mean that the owner of the field should offer this man something, but he doesn't because he's a miser. So then the miser asks him, "What is your occupation?" And he says, "I'm a Quran reciter." And he says, "Oh, your voice must be nice. Can you recite something?" And the man recites by the olive and Mount Sinai. And of course, this is a truncated piece of a verse that starts with by the fig. So God swears by the fig, the olive, and Mount Sinai. So the miser knows his Quran, and he says, "So what happened to the figs?" And the Tufaili answers him, you have hidden them under your garment. So instead of, lecturing the misers that they should be hospitable, they should share, and so on, and it sounding like a boring sermon, they criticize this behavior through a joke. And it becomes more acceptable for the reader to get the moral of the story, that misers should not be that miserly, and they should be hospitable.
Yeah. Can I also ask a question? First of all, can I say thank you very much, because I thought that was a fascinating talk. Sorry, my name is Sugra. I thought that was fascinating, and it was 15 to 20 minutes, but it was jam-packed with lots and lots of interesting information, examples, and anecdotes. I really appreciate that. And here are great questions. I was listening intently. My question is, following on from what you were saying a little while ago, in terms of public reception of matters relating to Islam. And I wonder how, I know you're an academic and you're in a field that isn't quite as public as yet. Maybe perhaps once you finish and you publish your material, you'll have a good sense of this. But if you've done any talks, if you've engaged with Muslim communities, and actually more interestingly, people who are not Muslim but are involved in religious studies in some way, could you give us a sense of what the reaction of people has been? Is it curiosity? Is it concern? Where are they coming from?
Okay, I have given the talk titled "Humour in Islam" many times. It's not always the same content. Sometimes I focus on the anecdotal collections from Arabic literature. Sometimes I focus on the hadith. Sometimes I mix both. like I tried to do with you today. I gave you one about the hadith and I gave you one article about the anecdotal material to give you a different view. So I change my content, but the title is always the same, Humour in Islam. So strangely enough, when I deal with Muslim audiences, they come in very apprehensively. They are lured by the title Humor in Islam because for them this is something very strange. How can Islam and humor gel? So they come out of curiosity to see where this will go. I had one instance where I gave this humor in Islam speech about the hadith. I only had instances from the hadith in a very conservative. I will not name names, but it's a conservative town in England, known for at least 60% South Asian population. And it was a lecture not in the university, it was for a Muslim organization. And I had almost 30% of the audience walk out of the lecture midway. They were appalled and they emailed the organizers very upset and with indignation. How could you invite this person? And how could you allow her to make fun of our Prophet and say that he was laughing with the companions? This is undignified, this is unacceptable. And the organizers were actually extremely on the game, and they scheduled another lecture, and they invited a religious scholar, a bona fide sheikh, and we had some sort of a discussion, me and him, where he had to admit that these are hadiths and they are sourced from hadith collections that are deemed authoritative, not just the forged hadiths, but they are like Sahih al-Bukhari has a few, Sahih Muslim has a few. In fact, there is one hadith that I deem completely forged. I don't believe that the Prophet could have said this hadith, but it is in Sahih al-Bukhari. Once this sheikh admitted that these ahadiths do exist in the authoritative collections, they asked me to give this lecture again. So they only kind of approved of it when it got the stamp of a cleric. Non-Muslim audiences are much more at ease with this, and they appreciate it more than the Muslim audiences because it gives them a side to Islam. They believe me. they don't accuse me of heresy or blasphemy, or they don't walk out on me. Mm-hmm. But they are much more at ease with changing their minds that Muslims are not, these image of the rage boy with bushy eyebrows, raised fists, and yelling that goes through the internet every time something happens. I mean, Google angry Muslim and you will have over 2 million hits. So the non-Muslim audiences appreciate a non-angry Muslim much more, and one who laughs and is able to crack jokes and even knows that the Prophet was easygoing and his companions, they didn't take themselves too seriously either. Then sadly, the Muslim population. The Muslim population, especially let's say in the diaspora, not in Muslim countries, they have a problem with humor in Islam. The Muslims in Muslim countries are more accepting of this than the Muslims in the diaspora, like in England, for example. For me this was weird,
but that makes also a lot of sense, because when people migrate, especially with little or no education, they, whether it's academic or theological education, they tend to hold on to what they knew when they were young, and although the world that they left moves on, their own memory of it and their own connection with it is still rooted 30, 40, even 50 years previous. So even they get a shock when they visit the so-called motherland and they realize that girls are cutting their hair and people are wearing colourful clothes and people laugh and smile on the street. It's a bit of a surprise. Yasmin,
Yeah, but this also speaks volumes about our own Islamic education. I mean, whether we are in the diaspora or we are in Islamic countries, we need to overhaul the Islamic education, what we know of our religion, because it seems that we don't know enough and we don't know the right things.
well, the example that you shared is really telling, right, in all of this, because they this organization hosted you. People, 30% of the audience felt that this was heretical, probably actually,
Yeah.
and therefore they couldn't partake in it. They couldn't even listen because they probably considered it a religious crime. But then when they had a religious scholars organization, when they invited you back, so that tells you an awful lot about where the communities come from on many occasions, right? So they defer all of their religious intellect, critical thinking, if that even exists, to these religious scholars. So as soon as somebody with a certain badge comes along and says, yeah, I may not agree with what she's saying, but she's saying the truth. These things are in existence. It changes the tone. But how did you feel about that? Because that's really interesting as a religious scholar, as an academic scholar, to be in that audience the second time around and actually to be rubber stamped in this way. How did that feel for you, and what does that tell you?
Actually, I was very happy that there was a second meeting, because if they had just walked out and left, there would have been no correction. They would have stayed for the rest of their lives thinking that this is heresy or blasphemy, or the prophet was a sourpuss and he didn't laugh, and they would have missed his humanity and his sense of humor. But for me, it was very important to have this second meeting, even if I needed the rubber stamp of approval of a cleric, for the sake of the people, not for mine. I mean, I'm doing this regardless of whether the audience approves or not. This is my dissertation, my PhD, so I'm going to finish it anyway, But for me, it is important to restore the Prophet's humanity to the people. And also, I have issues with the clerics, because whether we like it or we don't, Islam has been hijacked since a long time by the Wahhabi interpretation. The petrodollars have exported a certain very harsh interpretation of Islam. And the problem with the word Islam is that everyone thinks Islam is a monolith, and it's not. You have different facets of Islam. Islam in Morocco is different from Islam in China, whether you like it or you don't. Islam in Pakistan is different from Islam in Britain, even though the Muslims are, loads of them are Pakistanis, and Islam in I don't know, Indonesia is different from Islam in Egypt. So we can actually not speak of one Islam, and but this it's different interpretations that are colored by customs, localities, traditions from the places themselves where they have grown. And like, for example, I just give you one example to illustrate my point. In India, I've heard that the dowry is paid to the man and not to the woman in lots of areas in India, not across India, but in lots of areas in India. But the Quran says that the dowry should be paid to the woman. But this comes from the interaction with Hinduism or whatever other traditions exist in this locale. So there is a part that is religion, there is a part that is tradition, there is a part that is ideology, there is a part that is politics, and all this is wrapped up under the big umbrella of Islam. So the interpretation that has been prevalent since the 70s is a very strict Wahhabi one. You have seen the results, the Taliban, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and so on. And we have a very tolerant Islam in Morocco, for example, or in let's put it in a different way, in the places where there was an old existing civilization that merged with other people. Like India, for example, you had so many different ethnicities and so on. So the Islam there was much more tolerant, had a Sufi inkling, the Sufi shrines are visited by Hindus and Muslims alike, and nobody bats an eyelid. But this Wahhabi interpretation, where everything is prohibited, almost to the point that taking your next breath might be prohibited by someone tomorrow. And I don't like this, and for one, I'm trying to fight this interpretation and to restore the more lenient one. You had the Prophet have treaties with the Jews. He didn't kill them willy nilly. He only killed some of them when they betrayed him. So we need to find this spirit of the tolerance back. Today, they in Mecca, in the prayers, they say, God, make us victorious over the Jews and the Christians. When the Quran is talking about the Christians and the Jews as people of the book, and we can eat their food, and there are so many chapters in the Quran that speak about the people of the book and how Muslims should honor them. And in Mecca, in the Prophet's mosque in Medina, in Mecca, in the Kaaba, God's house, they invoke God's wrath on the Christians and the Jews. And we've come a long way from the early Islamic ideals to something that I don't even recognize as being 100% Islamic.
No, don't apologize. In terms of the reception that you've described of how different communities have engaged in or disengaged and then re-engaged and so on, and where do you see the most, I want to say welcoming, but the most interesting reception that people have had amongst Muslim communities? So do you find, and I know that you're in an academic institution, but do you find that when it comes to engaging with Muslim communities on this subject, there's a certain, can you identify a generational shift or maybe a gender difference?
Yes,
there a particular group
there is. The older generations are more easily accepting of entertaining the idea that there is humor in Islam, because I suppose they lived before the 70s, at the time before things became so rigid, or they came from other countries, from the motherland, so to speak, where things were more laid back than they are here. The young generation didn't see that. They weren't in a motherland. They were born here, raised here, and maybe they got their Islamic education from mosques or from, I don't know from where, but anyhow, not like their parents or their grandparents. And also women are more ready to accept that, because I think it has to do with women being a bit more emotional than men. They're more readily going to engage in laughter or in small talk or in, I don't want to say gossip, but conversation, rather than listening to a sermon. The men are used to this in Friday prayers. They go listen to whatever is being said and they leave. They don't necessarily engage. But women don't really attend Friday prayers, and their conversations are more a two-way street, not a one-way.
Do you think in universities you're finding a difference amongst younger generations?
In university, I don't know, because in university people are not so judgmental. In the university, you have a research. If you provide enough arguments, you can even write your research that God doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So nobody cares about what you are saying. They don't judge you. They care more about the form, whether you argue well enough, if you have enough good sources, if you are using the primary sources, if you're not making this up. This is more the academic setting. But when I spoke in conferences about this topic, the academians were eager to hear more, because academia is more or less a dry enterprise. So whenever someone is offering jokes and a laugh, people jump at that. So in the question and answer session, I expected the pertinent questions, and all they wanted were more jokes.
Well, actually, I admit when you stopped talking, I also felt the same. Could you give us a couple more anecdotes for a couple more jokes? Just because, it's rarely heard in the mainstream. Even if you engage in work with Muslim communities or even in a religious setting, we rarely hear this. So it's so refreshing. You add a very distinct layer of humanity as you had hoped on our sense of who the Prophet ﷺ was and how he was and how he behaved. And all too often, many people, including the people in New Horizons, have talked about we only ever learn about the Prophet's life, the seerah, through battles. And that's problematic because you don't get a sense of his humanity in the whole of his life. And so I think you're doing a great job.
Thank you.
Can I also ask one more question? When you're studying hadith, when you're studying text in relation to humor in Islam, do you get a sense of, is there a period throughout which there are recorded a hadith that tell us about humorous incidents where the Prophet was or wasn't involved? Is it just during the time of his last 23 years, or is there anything before that too?
No, it's throughout. It's. I mean, maybe I'm misleading you because in this era they only ever start more or less with the call to prophethood. So what you know of his life before the call to prophethood is minimal. He was born to so and so. He was raised there and there. He had a nursemaid who kept him 4 years, but you don't know the details. You know nothing much about his interaction with his nursemaid, for example. She could be the reason he was funny. I mean, she could be very open and laughing all the time to make him comfortable with laughter. I don't know. I mean, he obviously has a sense of humor that's God given, but you don't know who nurtured this. So we actually only know about his life from more details from the call to prophethood. But what happened before is just in bits and pieces, like bullet points. Not much details are known. But what the collections, even the seerah, not just the collections, the seerah works, his biography, they record instances with everybody, slaves, his wives, his grandchildren, people in the marketplace, his companions. It even records food fights with the wives, and he engages in this food fight. I mean, you would think like, oh my God, food fight, it's haram to waste food and so on. So one of the examples is Aisha cooked a meal, and Sauda came in to ask the Prophet something. She's another wife, and Aisha offers her to sit and eat, and she says, no, I don't like this dish. So Aisha gets upset and she yells at her, you will eat, and if you won't eat, I will smear this on your face. And Sauda says, I'm not eating, I don't like this dish. So Aisha actually puts her hand in the dish and smears some of the food on Sauda's face. And Sauda is very, very upset, and she complains to the Prophet. So then the Prophet hugs Aisha from behind so that she can't move, and he tells Sauda, take your vengeance. So Sauda dips her hand in the dish and smears the food on Aisha's face, and then everyone laughs, and it's done. So when you read this, you think, oh my God, they're just like anyone else, like slapstick comedy where they throw cake at each other, and you have also other pranks that the wives play on each other. They're jealous of each other. They all vie for his attention. They all want him for themselves, and they play pranks on each other. So Sauda receives a gift from Yemen that came with a caravan, and she receives a blouse, a new kameez, and a new veil from Yemen that is shiny, and new kohl for her eyes. And she goes and she prettifies herself. She wears the new clothes and so on. And they say, oh, we need to remedy this, because when he sees her, he will want to spend the night there, not with us or whatever. So they tell her, they knew that she was very afraid of the Dajjal, the false Messiah. So they tell her, do you know that the false Messiah is coming? I don't know who came with the caravan and said that he's coming tonight. So she gets really flustered and afraid. Where are you going to hide? So they point her to a tent somewhere in the vicinity. And this tent was known to be like a storage area where they stored things that they didn't need. It was dusty, full of cobwebs and so on. So she runs into this tent and hides there. And then the Prophet only sees her veil as she slides into this tent. And he asks what's going on. And they tell him Sauda just hid in that tent because she's afraid of the Antichrist or the Dajjal. So he goes into the tent to take her out and reassure her that he's not coming, that it's not the end of the world yet, and so on. And of course, she re-emerges from this tent completely covered in dust. Her new blouse is dirty, her veil doesn't shine anymore, and she was crying in frustration of fear from the Dajjal, so her kohl is smeared all over her face. And he reassures her and so on, and then he tells her that this is not true, is not happening. And she yells at the two women. I'm not saying their names because there are several versions. So in the different versions of this story, there are always two different wives.
Mm-hmm.
So she is really upset with them for doing this. But then it ends up that they all laugh together at this prank. So it shows you also the humanity of the wives of the Prophet and everyone else at that time. They were just like everyone else. They had fears. They had they felt jealous. They felt angry. They just like everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Yasmin. Thanks for your questions, Sugra. And we will be back with another critical thinking Skype session.